welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am, as usual, Jodelle, and I am so thrilled once again to have with me Dr. Peat, and he's my forever go-to source for all things health and nutrition related. Dr. Peat has a PhD in biology, and he has taught at numerous schools and universities, all things nutrition and women's health specifically. And you can learn more about him by visiting raypeat.com. That's RAYPEAT.com. And you'll be amazed at his science-based articles and newsletters, all of which we'll talk about later. I was completely in on the thyroid today. I'm really excited about talking about the thyroid because I have had thyroid issues resulting from a toxic mold exposure that I've since gotten better from. But I always love talking about the thyroid for that reason. And I wanted to let the listeners know to stay tuned because at the end, Dr. Peat, I really want to touch on the foods for the thyroid. I want to touch on, is exercise a do or a don't, and lifestyle habits that will amp up the thyroid. Also, we actually have 2 viewer or listener questions related to the thyroid, so I hope to get to those as well. So thank you once again for joining me. Let's get started. So many people speculate, Dr. Peat, that the reasons we have such a thyroid problem now more than ever is, you hear things like because of the chemicals in the food systems, or they say our poor water supply, or the fluoride in the water, or EMF radiation. I mean, all these different speculations on why we have such a low thyroid problem now. But I want your professional opinion. Why are thyroid problems such a problem these days?
All of those things contribute to the problem, but I think the basic, most common problem is the increase of polyunsaturated fats in the diet, vegetable oils, the liquid kind, basically. They inhibit the polyunsaturated fatty acids, inhibit the secretion of the hormone from the gland, and its transport in the blood, and its use in the cell in various ways. In the 1930s and early 40s, people were estimating that around 40% of the population suffered from some degree of hypothyroidism, as defined by symptoms. Since the late 19th century, symptoms of hypothyroidism were being described in the medical literature, and a low body temperature, tendency to have poor liver function, depression or excitatory brain symptoms, insomnia, high blood pressure, abnormally low blood pressure, many things, dozens of symptoms were well identified as mainly caused by hypothyroidism. And in the mid-1940s, a drug company synthesized what they called the thyroid hormone. It was a component found in the secretions of the thyroid gland, and it's called thyroxine. And it was made synthetically in the 1940s and came on the market as a treatment for hypothyroidism. But along with that marketing of a single chemical came a whole ideology. Since this new chemical didn't cure most of the symptoms that were known to identify hypothyroidism, those were decided in the literature, the advertising program of the company selling the synthetic thyroid. They were written out of the definition of hypothyroidism. Gradually, over the next 50 years, the only defining characteristic of hypothyroidism came to be an elevation of the pituitary hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, which rises when your thyroid is low, almost always. And that couldn't be measured in the 1930s, and so thyroid hormone. That they looked over a period of decades, looked for a way to define chemically exactly what the features of hypothyroidism were, so that they could have an exact basis for prescribing the synthetic hormone. And the first test was a blood test for protein-bound iodine, and that became the prescribing basis for more than 15 years. That people were tested for protein-bound iodine in the blood, and if this was low, then they could be prescribed the synthetic. But in the 1960s, it was shown that this protein-bound iodine had absolutely nothing to do with your thyroid function. It's a very sort of a more or less random event that can go with either high or low thyroid function. And eventually, a sensitive test for the pituitary hormone was developed, and progressively other indicators were thrown away, and doctors were told to rely only on measurement of TSH. And if it was above 10 of the standard units, that was said to be hypothyroidism. If it was below, at first they were saying 4, I think it was, of the units, that would be hyperthyroidism. And in the last 2 or 3 years, guidelines have been published in major medical journals advising doctors, almost threateningly, telling them not to pay any attention to the physiological signs that traditionally identified hypothyroidism. Go only by the measurement of TSH and return to a standard range, usually from between 3 and 5, I think, is the most common definition of normal for TSH.
It's so interesting that you mention that, because it seems like there are quite a few people that go to the doctor with classic symptoms of low thyroid function and then are yet diagnosed as, no, your thyroid's just fine, you're in range. So can you talk about why subclinical hypothyroidism is so prevalent? Why aren't they quick to look at the signs and symptoms and only look at the TSH?
When the company first marketed the synthetic thyroid, they said they had tested it on, I think it was 24 young male medical students. For some reason, I guess there weren't many female medical students at the time. But the funny thing about thyroid is hypothyroidism is several times more frequent in women, because estrogen messes with the function of all the functions of the thyroid. So they threw out most of the hypothyroid women from treatment in the first years. And I had obese friends in high school who had been previously diagnosed as needing a thyroid supplement, but they were told by the doctors, I heard it from all of my fat friends, that they had discovered that they were not, it was not a glandular problem they had, they were just gluttonous. People accepted that it was all, that they ate too much, not that their glands were being poisoned by something else in the environment.
Right, and so that's why you hear doctors saying now, eat less, move more. That's their prescription now when we see these people with thyroid issues.
Yeah, and the women who could stay obese despite saying that they ate almost nothing. Doctors were taught that women were basically lying about how much they ate. But someone did a study, had women in a locked hospital ward where there's no possibility of getting extra food. And it was found that these women who said they ate almost nothing but gained weight, they were found to be able to maintain their weight on a diet of 700 calories a day. The only way to do that is to be very hypothyroid. But it's still very common for extremely hypothyroid women in particular to be diagnosed as gluttonous rather than hypothyroid.
Isn't that sad? Well, let's talk about some of the major symptoms that someone would see if they suspect they might have low thyroid. Like, what are some of the major signs they would notice and see clearly, like with their own body?
When I was 9 or 10 years old, I started noticing symptoms in myself that I saw that more girls had similar symptoms. I didn't see any other boys with migraine headaches and nearsightedness. But these often begin in puberty as a result of low thyroid. And I've known girls in their teens who had just suddenly become nearsighted. And when a doctor gave them thyroid in a timely manner, their vision was corrected to normal. So chronic myopia is one of the very frequent signs of hypothyroidism. Weight loss, inability to gain weight, was known more than 100 years ago. 1890, the first publication relating the wasting disease. They called it cachexia strumipriva, caused by loss of the thyroid function. So overweight or underweight both can be caused by low thyroid. The thyroid hormone is an anabolic hormone that builds proteiny tissues and bones. But doctors, by getting most things upside down, doctors warn that excess thyroid will cause osteoporosis. But animal experiments way back in the 1940s, for example, on rabbits, they fed them 1% of their food by weight was thyroid gland, a gigantic diet equivalent to like 20 grains probably of thyroid hormone for a person. And their metabolism went up so much that they were starved to death no matter how much they ate, and so it became very thin, but their bones became abnormally strong and dense, showing that the anabolic effect on the bones takes precedence over even a starvation diet. And lacking this anabolic tissue restoring effect of thyroid, when your actual metabolism is slowing down in a thyroid deficiency, the emergency stress hormones, starting with adrenaline and including cortisol, rise to maintain function, but at the expense of your muscles and bones. And so you're, even if you are eating a good diet, these stress hormones can damage your tissues, make your muscles and bones atrophy, leading to osteoporosis and connective tissue diseases in which your muscles and skin and tendons, ligaments all deteriorate.
Wow. That makes me think about like cellulite. So would low thyroid, you mentioned the tissue would be not building up the way it should, so which makes me think that the tissue would then be thinner, like kind of crepey skin, to where cellulite might become more prevalent. Would that be the case with low thyroid?
Yeah, the skin becomes thinned under the high cortisol, which breaks down proteins, and they aren't replaced when your thyroid is low. Protein synthesis is pretty much turned off. And while the skin gets thinner, in the low thyroid condition, estrogen is left in an exaggeratedly active form, and you retain water, but you don't retain salt in proportion. So you become waterlogged, actually hypotonic relative to the normal concentration of salt. And the salt, when it's retained normally under the influence of thyroid hormone, the salt associates with albumin in the blood and pulls water from the tissues into the bloodstream and delivers it to the kidneys to be excreted. In low thyroid, you lose the sodium in the urine, and so the albumin, instead of forming a sort of a cloud in the bloodstream of ionized sodium atoms along with the ionized albumin, the albumin no longer has this osmotic ability to retain water in the bloodstream, keeping up the blood volume and keeping it out of the tissues. So the water is allowed to fall out of the blood vessels, cause tissue to swell, and the albumin, in the absence of sodium, goes along to some extent with the water, and that becomes a viscous, extravascular solution. Protein and any sodium that might be there will form a kind of jelly-like mass around cells. They instead of ordinary edema in this condition, when albumin has leaked out of the blood vessels, it becomes mucus-like edema. And that used to be the most common defining feature of hypothyroidism, was mixed edema or mucus-like edema. And this water retention in relatively healthy women, there's a tendency of the estrogen at the time of ovulation to suppress thyroid function a little bit and cause a little bit of sodium loss and a little bit of leakage of water into the tissues. But if it only goes on for a few days, it doesn't become mixed edema, like it's just a passing monthly edema or swelling.
I think this is so important for so many people to hear this, because I don't think people think of water retention as a symptom of low thyroid, and so many people have that too. I know you had mentioned cortisol as well as kind of a culprit behind the issue with the water retention too. And so talk to me about how like high cortisol, is that the precursor to low thyroid, or does high cortisol result from the thyroid dropping down low?
Thyroid keeps your energy running efficiently so that glucose is turned into carbon dioxide, and you get many times more molecules of ATP to do your work than you would if you didn't have the thyroid. Thyroid deficiency is like an oxygen deficiency, and you burn your sugar wastefully, producing lactic acid instead of carbon dioxide, and don't produce the ATP needed to do all of the cellular work like making protein. sugar becomes unstable and tends to drop sharply with exertion. As the lactic acid rises, the blood sugar drops, and both of those, the falling blood sugar and the rising lactic acid, trigger adrenaline and cortisol. And the cortisol breaks down your proteiny tissues, including muscles and connective tissues, and your immune system, to produce sugar. So the cortisol and the adrenaline will rise as your thyroid falls, and they will keep function going, but at the expense of good structural maintenance processes. So you get apparent normal blood sugar in the normal range, but at the expense of breaking down your muscles and skin too fast.
Makes complete sense. So that's actually the low thyroid that actually leads to the issues with adrenaline and cortisol. And so with regard to stress, what are some of the biggest stressors in our lives that might be the initial cause of low thyroid?
In the healthy person, you can do an intense exercise session. You can run maybe half a block and have no production of lactic acid at all. But there's a threshold. The more you use your oxygen, increase your energy production rate, you will find a level at which you have used your oxygen too fast and you start producing lactic acid. And the lactic acid causes these tissue-damaging cortisol increasing effects. So the lactate threshold in a good athlete is very high. They can run a long distance or perform many weight lifts before increasing the lactic acid production. So that's a very safe kind of exercise and activity where you don't reach the lactate threshold. But a hypothyroid person, the worse your thyroid status is, the worse your oxygen metabolism is, and the closer you are to the lactate threshold, until just sitting still, a hypothyroid person will have increased lactic acid. So when you hyperventilate, if you're a normal person, sit still and breathe as fast as they can for a minute, they're going to blow out so much carbon dioxide by that over-breathing that the lack of carbon dioxide creates a hypothyroid imitating condition in which you produce lactic acid. But a person on the borderline of hypothyroidism is at rest, is in effect hyperventilating. They're at their lactate threshold, and then any further activity is going to just increase the lactic acid and further increase the cortisol and destructive processes. And fairly recently, people have realized that serotonin increases with stressful exercise, and it's the signal directly that activates the pituitary gland, turning on the adrenals to produce cortisol. And so the serotonin is now recognized as a signal of fatigue and also something associated with hypothyroidism. The excess pain signaling and fatigue signaling function of serotonin goes with hypothyroid.
Wow, so the low energy that a lot of people feel on hypothyroid, if they are low thyroid, could actually be high serotonin, right?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. See, no one talks about serotonin being a negative. You always hear it being a positive, and so it's neat to hear a doctor actually saying, we need to really be careful with how much we're elevating our serotonin.
It increases the corticotropin release hormone, which then turns on ACTH, which then turns on the adrenal stress hormones. Mm-hmm. And serotonin is right at the heart of our stress system.
And so with so many people running on adrenaline and high stress, and they already might be low thyroid and having this high serotonin, what happens when they're running on adrenaline? They're not sleeping, and even from my understanding, low thyroid causes sleeping issues too. So when you're not sleeping, what's this vicious circle here that we're talking about?
Some of the people, early sleep studies where they monitored brain waves and could define the different levels of sleep, found that hypothyroid people never got below the second level of sleep, never reached deep reparative sleep. Mm-hmm. And so hypothyroidism very often involves difficulty getting to sleep, but almost by definition, it involves inadequate quality of sleep, waking up feeling unrested, often with pains that are worse before in the morning before any activity than they were at bedtime.
So with regard to sleep, a lot of people sleep with their cell phones right by their head, or they get up in the night if they can't sleep. Let's say they are low thyroid and they flick their phone on to play games or whatever, to go on Facebook or whatever, and so the blue light's blasting in their face. Are they doing themselves any favors as far as their thyroid when they're exposed to EMF radiation and blue light constantly?
Yeah, I think almost any stimulus, but especially a random cell activating thing like a cell phone. For a few days, I would get insomnia, hard to go to sleep, and I found that taking a very small amount of T3 would put me right to sleep 5 or 10 minutes after taking 10 micrograms. Mm-hmm. And on one of my trips, I was going to speak at a conference sponsored by a doctor, and the day before I got there, I saw him, and he said he hadn't slept for 3 or 4 nights and was just in a desperate condition. And I told him my experience and gave him some 10 microgram cytomel tablets. And the next day, as I went to the conference, before he let me talk, he pulled me aside and said, "That stuff is better than morphine."
And so how does that relate to as far as like the EMF? Are we depleting ourselves with constant radiation and blue light? Is that what we're missing out on? Is that conversion to T3? Is that where it's coming from?
Yeah. If you keep in mind that the thyroid lets you get into the deepest layer of sleep, mm-hmm. The muscle physiology is very analogous to the brain physiology. Mm-hmm. And an old way of diagnosing hypothyroidism was to have a person kneel on a chair so their toes hung down freely. Mm-hmm. And then something on the Achilles tendon triggers a reflex of the muscle in the calf. Mm-hmm. And it makes the toes jerk out and then fall back. The diagnosis of hypothyroidism is when the relaxation phase, where the toes fall back into the relaxed position, mm-hmm. is retarded. So it looks like there's a pneumatic door closer on it. A healthy reflex, the toe jumps out and bounces back just like a loose piece of pork chop hanging there. Mm. It bounces and sways. But a hypothyroidism person relaxes very slowly so that it comes back in little notchy movements exactly to where it stopped, and it might take half a second brain is the same way. It's very slow to relax in hypothyroidism. It takes energy to relax a muscle. ATP has to be regenerated. Same in the brain. It takes regeneration of ATP to relax the brain. And in the absence of thyroid, the brain simply can't get up enough energy to relax and go to sleep.
And I would say the radiation from the devices and the electromagnetic radiation is probably blocking that as well, the brain waves.
Yeah, the cells are staying in a semi-excited state, so they're more sensitive to any kind of stimulation. And the people who are extremely sensitive to stimulation, such as a cell phone, are the ones who are hypothyroid. Their cells are already half stimulated. They can't reach a deeply relaxed condition.
It makes sense, because if your body is on high alert because there's a stressor, because it's not functioning optimally, because you're, not functioning in an area that should be so critical to health, which is your thyroid, then it's almost like the body is resistant against shutting down or repairing or, getting rid of anything it needs to get rid of in the night, toxins and repairing tissues and things like that. It's just not going to do that. It's almost like it's just in survival mode. Is that right?
The deep sleep restores and renews everything, and the cortisol increase towards dawn is greater when your energy production from thyroid activity is impaired, and so your stress starts out at a higher level in the morning, and hyperthyroid people often feel best at sunset because the light has helped restore steroid production to some extent and lower the cortisol.
So that kind of makes sense that there's so many studies on red light, because red light closely matches the light of the sunset, that there are so many studies saying that red light's actually beneficial to the thyroid.
Yeah, it increases circulation, among other things. But one of the types of stimulation that keeps cells from relaxing is a background, more or less free radical activity, an excess of electrons, because the oxygen isn't withdrawing electrons. The cell stays in a reductive condition. Too many electrons, not enough oxygen. And that is coincident with the excitability. For example, the glutathione in a well-oxidized cell should form the disulfide bonds associating proteins with glutathione and glutathione to some extent with itself, and binding proteins into a stable condition. And when your thyroid can't withdraw the electrons completely, your cell has a highly reduced state with too much free reduced glutathione, and that, if that becomes chronic, this state of chronic excitation leads to all of the degenerative diseases, ultimately cancer, which is an ultimate failure of the cells to relax and reach the reparative high energy state. Oxidation fails chronically in cancer cells, and all of the other degenerative conditions involve some degree of the same over-reduced, under-oxidized energy failure process, all of which would be preventable by keeping your thyroid function proper.
Okay, you reminded me of the fact that the liver is actually really important when it comes to the thyroid and hormone conversion. And so when you said glutathione, it reminded me, like, we probably need to let listeners know, like, how important the liver is to the thyroid. Can you talk about that?
In the 1940s, when soldiers were coming back after being in prison camp and on a starvation diet for a year or two, many of them, when they started eating enough, many of them developed breasts, and this led doctors to investigate why these formerly starved soldiers suddenly started growing breasts when they ate a good diet. And they found that starvation stops the liver from excreting estrogen. The same thing can happen in various liver diseases, but starvation is the basic thing that prevents the liver from detoxifying things. And estrogen is active in such extremely small amounts that it's the first thing you usually see when the liver function slows down. And when the liver is not able to attach either glucuronic acid or sulfuric acid to the estrogen molecule, letting it become water soluble and leave the body either in the bile or urine, it quickly accumulates to an excess. And at the same time that the liver has started letting estrogen stay in the body, the low energy is also decreasing the ability to metabolize cholesterol, and you can't make progesterone and DHEA and the protective steroids, which counteract estrogen. So man's testosterone and DHEA fall as the estrogen increases when something has damaged his liver. Any kind of injury, sickness or traumatic injury that sends a man to a hospital, when they give a blood test, they will often find his estrogen level is 2 or 3 times or more higher than normal, even higher than a woman's normal estrogen level, just because stress of any kind is likely to stop that liver function of getting rid of estrogen. And as estrogen accumulates, it blocks all of the thyroid functions. And since the thyroid is necessary to activate the liver to excrete estrogen, then a trauma can set up a chronic hypothyroid state and glandular failure, organ failure, and so on.
This is so good. So, and what I learned from you is that the thyroid and the liver work in tandem together as far as the T4 to T3 conversion has to happen with the liver, and only if you have enough glycogen or you're getting enough glucose. And that would stand to reason, like when you said the starvation diet is similar to what people are doing today, this intermittent fasting or days and days of fasting, and they think they're doing their body a service, but really they're slowing down their thyroid, or they're at least harming their conversion. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, many diet studies have found that you oxidize fat at a high rate. The first, in some people, the first 12 hours, in some people, the first 24 hours. You keep oxidizing fat when you go on a starvation diet and lose fat for maybe your first day. But at some point, you have depleted your stored glycogen, and that blocks the formation of the active T3 thyroid hormone. And from that point on, you're relying for energy to an increased extent on the breakdown of tissue protein, turning it into fat. And so a more or less starvation diet that goes on for a week or two will I think it's about 80% of your weight loss is in the form of muscle loss, and very little, maybe 20% in the form of fat loss. Right. But if you eat enough sugar and have the minerals such as in fruit, and keep a slight protein intake, the small amount of sugar will prevent the breakdown of proteiny tissues, and a 10 to 14 day diet in this case will cause you to lose maybe 80% fat and only 20% muscle. So a starvation diet after the first 12 to 24 hours is turning off your thyroid, turning on the destructive tissue breakdown. In one experiment, people were put on a treadmill and adjusted, the tilt of the treadmill was adjusted so that they kept a steady heart rate of no faster than 120 beats per minute, just like you were walking down the street. And they had blood tests at intervals, and almost everyone stopped producing T3 in the first hour of that mild exercise. Wow. So when your T3 is turned off, whether it's by starvation or by excess activity, that's the point at which you start breaking down proteiny tissues.
Okay, so you heard it here, folks. We don't want to go without some sugar. So you actually can have sugar and actually have a really well-functioning thyroid. And I wanted to talk about the fact that when you had mentioned that you had supplemented with T3, so obviously, and I've heard you say many times that you really feel like natural thyroid medication would benefit most people. And so I wanted you to touch on just exactly like how would you go about telling someone to begin supplementing if they think they have low thyroid but their doctor's not really doing anything about it?
I think everyone who thinks about that as a possibility should read Broda Barnes' book, Hypothyroidism, The Unsuspected Illness.
Yeah, that's a good book.
Or his other book on preventing heart attacks by taking. In his whole career, he didn't have any patients die of heart attacks, or he should have had, I think he said, more than 1,000 from the number of patients that he had. He basically prevented all of the heart attacks in his patients by giving them an appropriate amount of thyroid. And most of his people, in the long run, were getting 2 grains of Armour thyroid. He would start them on usually a half a grain, 30 milligrams, and watch their temperature over the first several weeks. And if their temperature didn't rise to normal, he would then add another half grain. And it took him typically several months to find exactly the right dose for each patient, but most of them would need around 2 grains.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned temperature. That's something really easy that a lot of people listening could do, is if they suspect they might have low thyroid, they could take their temperature, right? And that will tell them if their body is running a little cooler than it should be. That means the thyroid's not functioning, right?
Yeah, and Broda Barnes worked in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where you seldom have hot and humid weather. And one hot and humid summer in Eugene, I noticed obviously hypothyroid people coming in with a normal temperature. And I realized that a dead person in Florida can maintain a normal temperature if the environment is at 98 degrees and humid. Then a potato will maintain adequate body temperature. So you have to look at other signs if the weather is humid, or if they sleep with an electric blanket and anything artificial. So the pulse rate is another thing that helps to interpret. When you're very hypothyroid, the adrenaline is the first thing to rise during the night when you use up your glycogen, and then the cortisol increases, and most people have their highest cortisol at dawn because the glycogen has been used up. But if your temperature is below normal when you wake up, everyone has a lower metabolic rate during the night, so it's normal to be as much as 0.8 of a degree below normal when you wake up. But it should rise right after breakfast and stay up at around 98.6 until around sunset. But I saw that besides the low temperature, some people would have a very fast pulse when they first woke up, because their adrenaline was high, but the cortisol hadn't risen enough to slow down the adrenaline effect. And a very fast pulse, along with a low temperature at waking, is very common in hypothyroid people. And the pulse should slow down to normal after breakfast, but where the normal thing is for the metabolic rate to come back to normal when you eat breakfast, and that brings up the pulse rate and the temperature in healthy people. But the high adrenaline can cause an artificially rapid pulse in a hypothyroid person.
Yeah, I felt that when I went through my hypothyroid spell. Like, I remember hearing my heart beat very fast on my pillow. So if people are feeling that in the night when they're laying down, that's not normal. Also, like, cold hands and feet is not normal. Being cold all the time and having to carry a sweater everywhere, that's not normal. So those are some things people should watch out for, yes?
Just a doctor should be able to diagnose hypothyroidism most of the time just by shaking hands with the person, right? Because they almost always have cold hands.
So I want to touch on now the food aspect, because I know at the very beginning you talked about how PUFA, polyunsaturated fats, are probably the biggest culprit when it comes to why we see so many thyroid problems. But can you tell us what, other than like crowding out the PUFAs, what does a healthy diet for the thyroid look like, and how often should one eat? You know, can you talk about the dangers of those PUFAs even in small amounts and things like that?
I mentioned that one of the effects of high estrogen, low thyroid is the loss of sodium. And when you lose sodium, you increase aldosterone. And aldosterone is closely connected to parathyroid hormone, which is the regulator of calcium. And so if you don't eat enough calcium, you'll have high parathyroid hormone. If you don't eat enough salt or can't retain it, you'll have high aldosterone. And stress causes you to lose both sodium and calcium. And it happens that aldosterone and parathyroid hormone both suppress mitochondrial oxidation, the same effect as not enough thyroid hormone. And so the low thyroid is failing to activate the mitochondria, and its effects are increasing these two other hormones, aldosterone and parathyroid hormone, which activate, which block the mitochondrial respiratory enzymes turn off energy production. So that's three ways from this interaction that you're knocking out your productive use of oxygen and glucose. So getting enough calcium and sodium in your diet, and the only way to tell the amount of sodium practically is whether you crave it. Women premenstrually very often have intense salt cravings, and I've known many who avoided salt because of medical recommendations that eating salt raises blood pressure and so on, but they would avoid salt, and if anything, their water retention got worse. That's because it's when you avoid salt, you increase parathyroid hormone, aldosterone and parathyroid hormone, and those both work with hypothyroidism to turn off energy production.
So calcium is very important in a thyroid, very, very pro-thyroid. Adding salt and sea salt probably is best with all the mineral content to your diet would be good. And then crowding out the PUFA. Anything else? Like I know you're a big fan of saturated fats too.
Yeah, saturated fats are, they avoid many of the effects, inflammatory effects of the polyunsaturated fats. Linoleic acid directly leads to forming arachidonic acid, which its mere presence leads to the formation of prostaglandins, which have many pro-inflammatory effects, including loss of bone, calcium. And so the rising adrenaline, when your thyroid is low, rising adrenaline liberates arachidonic acid, which turns to prostaglandin, which breaks down bone and makes you lose bone tissue and turns on the parathyroid hormone.
In our schooling, we were told that linoleic acid and things like arachidonic acid and things like that there's good prostaglandins, there's bad, there's 2 essential fats that you should really have. And I'm hearing you say this, and it's like counterintuitive to everything that I was told, but yet yours makes so much logic sense. When you break it down like that, it makes so much sense why we wouldn't want to have those things.
Yeah, just recently, people are starting to look at the consequences of having the arachidonic acid, prostaglandin, rise as you accumulate fat with aging. The brain gets more and more polyunsaturated fats, and they're starting to look at the role of prostaglandin in Alzheimer's disease, among other things. The Alzheimer's brain has lots of spontaneous oxidation of fats into substances called isoprostanes and neuroprostanes, which are spontaneous equivalents of the enzyme-produced prostaglandins, but they are made from both N-3 and N-6 fatty acids in the stressed brain, and go with are increased in Alzheimer's disease. And following the idea of essential fatty acids, in the 60s, people were told to eat more linoleic acid because it's an essential fatty acid. When it was found that that was increasing both cancer and heart disease, the marketers turned to the fish oil type of N-3. But still, those are accumulating in the tissues, in the blood vessels, leading to plaque formation in the brain, leading to various kinds of underfunctioning of the brain tissue.
So you've heard it here, folks. You don't need to take a fish oil pill. You can eat sugar, and you want to make sure that you get rid of the ones they are calling the essential fatty acids, like linoleic acid. Instead, you can eat a really awesome pro-thyroid diet of things like cheese and milk and good seafood and well-cooked vegetables occasionally, and getting some good starches from your fruits. Yes, Dr. Peat?
Yes, and keeping the ratio of calcium to phosphate high enough is an important part of keeping things in balance. Some Americans have 5, 6, or 7 times as much phosphate in their diet as calcium, where you should have approximately equal amounts, or maybe twice as much is safe. But the high phosphate turns on parathyroid hormone and leads to the degenerative, ultimately cancer-forming processes of turning off oxidative energy and compensating with lactic acid formation.
Yeah, so avoiding too much like red meat it would help that balance, like not eating just so much red meat and stuff like that.
Yeah, meat and beans are both very bad
high in phosphate
proteins because of their high phosphate.
Yeah. Moving on to lifestyle, though, what are some lifestyle changes we can make in order to improve the thyroid naturally? Like you mentioned the sunset, being in that sunset light. Is red light something that would be beneficial for us to use daily? Or what other lifestyle things could we do as far as like habits we could adopt?
Being outside as much as possible is very important. The people who work outside 10 hours a day, cowboys and such, have terrible skin on their face if they don't use a good hat. The sunburn does age your skin, but these people have a very low incidence of internal cancers, breast cancer, prostate cancer, bowel cancer, and so on, because the red light inactivates the free radicals or active electrons and reduces inflammation while maintaining good circulation.
Yeah, I have to jump in here real quick because my husband works in outside more than 10 hours a day. He owns his own lawn business, and he will be glad to know that he is avoiding cancer by doing so. And he has, just to give a little plug to you, he follows kind of your principles of eating and has lost 25 pounds since doing so. So he really enjoys his milk and orange juice in the morning.
One of these studies in around 1960 that the oil industry doesn't like to talk about, they shaved rabbits so that the sunlight hit their skin directly. And they fed one the essential fatty acids, the other they gave, I forget whether it was butter or coconut oil, but a high saturated fat diet. And the ones on the so-called essential fatty acids, the PUFA, they got very wrinkly, sun-damaged skin. The ones on the saturated fat had good skin despite the constant sunlight exposure.
Wow. That's fantastic for people that want to know some natural skincare they could do. They could just change the oils that they're eating from PUFA to saturated fat. So that's good to know. As far as exercise, I know you had mentioned that even that small bout of walking on a bit of an incline actually lowered thyroid. So in your opinion, what would you tell someone who is experiencing low thyroid and trying to correct it? What would be the best form of exercise to help their thyroid, and what would they want to avoid?
Having adequate carbohydrate when you set out, and then again as soon as you finish.
Okay, good.
Like some fruit juice and milk before and after contains maybe some salty, like athletes who take a spoonful of baking soda before exercise. It's both the carbon dioxide released from it and the sodium, both of them have an anti-stress, anti-lactate effect that make you return to normal more quickly.
That's a really good tip. So even like kind of old school mentality, I heard it said back when I was doing a lot of bodybuilding early on in 2000, is like we always ate carbs right before we worked out. We always ate carbs right after. So that kind of principle still stands. So this kind of brings me to, as long as you still have a few more minutes, Dr. Peat, I have two listener questions that I wanted to go to because they were kind of really great questions. The first one is, and I guess I should ask you, are you okay on time right now? Can we keep going a few more minutes? Okay, great.
Yes.
He says, can Dr. Peat explain the connection between thyroid and the autonomic nervous system?
The adrenaline connection is an important part of it. The adrenaline compensates keeping your functions going despite being low thyroid. And if you supplement with thyroid after having been hypothyroid for a while and having very high adrenaline, your first reaction to the supplement is to have an excessively high heart rate, because the thyroid makes you sensitive to the thyroid, which is to the adrenaline, which is there. So you experience the excess adrenaline, and it takes a while to convince your autonomic nervous system to quiet down and let thyroid take care of it. That usually takes a week or so to slowly increase the thyroid and reduce the excess adrenaline. But the adrenaline itself has many protective functions if you don't have tissues loaded with polyunsaturated fats, because a surge of adrenaline releases fatty acids, and if they're unsaturated, they start forming these spontaneous equivalents of prostaglandins as well as real prostaglandins, and causing inflammation and degeneration. If you release saturated fats, they can't form those pro-degenerative molecules.
I'm so glad you said that about the I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The jitteriness, or somebody who experiences that high adrenaline rush after taking a natural thyroid supplement, because that happened to me, and I've heard it happen to several other people, and I kind of felt the same way, like without knowing. I kind of felt exactly what you were saying is, well, I have to kind of teach my body to get rid of this excess adrenaline. That's kind of what I portrayed to my clients, is like, keep taking it. Your body's going to get used to the actual feeling of having an adequate thyroid functioning.
Yeah, that's very common, and because so many doctors think of thyroid as a speed equivalent, people very often will stop using thyroid. They become afraid of this overstimulated state where they should reach the point of relaxation.
Yeah. Okay, so that's great to know about the autonomic nervous system. So that's a great question. The next question, the final question was, can you talk about carotenemia or carotenemia and how to resolve it when you're trying to recover the thyroid? So I would assume this individual is talking about having kind of that yellowish skin or having too high of carotene.
Around 1940, people who were doing surgery sometimes saw that a woman's ovaries in hypothyroidism, the corpus luteum, it's named the yellow body because it normally has a yellow color. They found that in hypothyroid women, sometimes the corpus luteum was red rather than yellow because of the beta-carotene, which is red, having reached such a high level in hypothyroidism. And when it reaches such high levels, it blocks progesterone production, but leaves the accumulation of estrogen. So you can't produce progesterone, and progesterone is needed to produce DHEA and other steroids. The whole cholesterol conversion process goes bad when you're poisoned with carotene. And vitamin B12 is needed to break the carotene molecule into two vitamin A molecules. So you have to make sure your vitamin B12 is adequate. I saw one man who had a toxic level of carotene in his body and no detectable vitamin A in his blood. When he took vitamin B12, I think it was just a week, and he had a reversed blood test, high normal vitamin A and very low carotene. As fast as that, because vitamin B12 deficiency necessarily blocks the formation of real vitamin A. And the thyroid makes you need vitamin A because it's involved in the conversion of cholesterol to progesterone, DHEA, all of the steroids. And as your metabolism rises, you're using your cholesterol faster to make progesterone. And that means that your cholesterol will be used. You'll cure your hypercholesterolemia at the same time you're curing your carotenemia. If your thyroid is at a proper level and you're eating such that you have adequate vitamin B12.
Okay, so that's so cool how the thyroid, you're healing the thyroid and you're healing so many other things at the same time. So I think that brings us to a good stopping point, Dr. Peat, and this has been such a valuable podcast. I think anyone and everyone will benefit from something in this podcast. So you guys make sure and share it with anybody you know that's having some thyroid issues, or you know someone that's dealing with low thyroid or hypothyroidism. Dr. Peat, your newsletter is something all my listeners would also benefit from, and the information you keep providing in it is worth the small cost of the newsletter. So I really encourage my listeners to give back to Dr. Peat for his time and wealth of information and purchase his newsletter. So, Dr. Peat, can you tell them how they can do that and how affordable it actually is?
Okay, the email address is raypeatsnewsletter@gmail.com. And for 12 bi-monthly issues, that's 2 years, it's $28 by email.
Yeah, and it is worth every penny. I have so enjoyed them, and I think all of my listeners will too. And it's just a great way to give back to you. We so appreciate your time and your wealth of information. So with that, I will let you go today, and I hope you will join me again for another podcast because I have so much more I want to ask you. So thank you so much, Dr. Peat.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right, thanks you guys, and we'll say bye for now. Hey out there, I'm about to drop one more bit of knowledge about why you should drop an F-bomb. So I have ripped open a packet of coconut oil here, but I'm not going to eat it. I am going to use it as a little natural moisturizer. So you know how when you travel you don't want to take a whole lot, especially nowadays they only let you take a carry-on. And maybe you're just going away for the weekend and you need some moisturizer, you need some sunscreen to take with you. Well, guess what? Coconut oil is kind of nature's sunscreen. So you pack one of these little bad boys with you, and not only can you eat it, but you can put it on your skin. And it's nature's best sunscreen because it's a natural way to protect from the sun in a low-grade way, so you can stay out all day, get a little color, but not get burnt. Also, maybe after the gym you want to moisturize and then head to work, you can use this. Maybe you need to get a little dryness out of your hair. This is a wonderful way to saturate the hair and really soothe the hair. Pour it all over your head, let it sit with a shower cap for a couple hours, and then rinse it out and wash it, and you're going to have really soft, silky hair. And your scalp will be soothed too. If you have kind of itchy scalp, coconut oil is great for that. There are so many great reasons to have a packet of coconut oil with you, not just for eating, but also for body and skincare purposes. It works great as a face oil and a body oil. So check out dropinfbomb.com and get some of these handy dandy little packets to keep with you. Even if you're not into eating it, you're going to find it really beneficial to just take on the go with you. Oh, also, you can use my code GETFIT, GETFIT, to save 20%. Thanks for watching.